All right, welcome to the home stretch. In part 11 of Advanced Workflows with Adobe Premiere, we are going to look at different types of deliveries and even walk through delivery specs for a broadcast TV show and a commercial. Now, delivery specs are completely dependent on a video's final destination, but with some basic understanding, you'll be able to navigate any kind of spec that is thrown your way. The first thing I want to look at is texted versus textless deliveries. Now, a texted delivery refers to the final video having graphics with text on screen. And it's basically the final video that you're used to seeing on the internet, on TV, in movies, whatever. And it's going to come with a stereo mix, typically, or with surround sound if that's available. Now, a textless delivery is probably a new phrase you might not have heard of. Textless deliveries have their text graphics removed so that only blank plates remain. This is why they're also called generic. So textless files will also have audio that's split out into DME stems for separate dialogue, music, and effects. All of this textless business is done so that videos can be localized to regions around the world in different languages. The localization process might happen in-house, where you work, or it might be sent out to an outside vendor. When you have a client that requests a texted and a textless delivery, there's a good chance that they're also going to provide you with their own specs that they want you to adhere to. But there's a few general things that almost all of these specs are going to have in common. And that's going to be, we're going to remove the graphics for a textless pass as well as give them split audio with dialogue, sound effects, and music. So let's take a look at our textless clip. We're going to come up here and make a new sequence because in Premiere, just to look at it, if we go to our sequence settings, we don't have an option in our sequence settings to change the audio configuration of a sequence after it's already been created. See, it's grayed out. So we'll say cancel, and I'm going to come make a new sequence, go to my tracks tab, and change my master to multi-channel and add 6 channels of audio. Now you might be wondering, if we have 3 tracks of audio, why do we need 6 channels? Well, that's because each of these tracks is a stereo track, so it actually has a left and a right channel. So you have to double up the amount of tracks that you need to make the 6 channels. So with that, I'll rename this Better Editor, Scramble King, Final, Textless. Say okay. Let's move this up to our sequences, and I'll go ahead and rename our original sequence Texted. I like the abbreviations. And let's open this one up, select all, copy it, and then jump into our textless timeline and paste. Stretch that out. Okay, so everything looks exactly as it was, except now we can configure our audio settings. So let's start there. So to configure our audio tracks, we're going to right click and go to Track Output Channel Assignments. Go here. And so we want our tracks 1 and 2 to go to audio track 1. Great. So I'm going to say okay. I'm going to move down my sound effects and my music onto tracks 3 and 4, and then my music onto tracks 5 and 6. This way, I can make sure that all of these get output to the correct channels. So tracks 1 and 2, go to 1 and 2. Okay. Now I'm going to go to tracks 3 and 4. We're going to turn off 1 and 2, send those to 3 and 4. Same thing here. And for our music track, we're going to go track output and make this 5 and 6. Okay, perfect. We're in good shape. That's what we need there. So let's go ahead and lock those. Whoop. And now we want to turn off any graphics in our piece. Luckily, because we built this in a very smart way and it's been cleaned up, all of our graphics are on this single video track. We can either turn them off with the little eye icon, or we can disable them, which is my preference because I like to visibly be able to see that these are off. So that looks good. Now the last thing that we want to do is change our slate. So our slate needs to read that this is a textless track, but how do we identify that on the slate itself? So we're going to come in here, and instead of stereo, we're going to actually tell the person looking at this slate what the audio configuration is. By that, I mean we're going to go channel 1 and 2 DX. Enter channel 3 and 4 FX, and channel 5 and 6 MX. So that tells us that channels 1 and 2 are dialogue, channels 3 and 4 are sound effects, and channels 5 and 6 are music. Okay, otherwise everything else looks good there. We'll zoom back out and we're good to go. Now, how do we export this? That's the next important thing. For our textless version, we can export this as we typically would. Make it a ProRes file, it's going to export a stereo clip. To give the split audio on our textless version, we'll say export. Make this a ProRes file because we can't do split audio out of Premiere Pro with an H.264. Go to Apple ProRes 422. And then under audio, we are going to say output 6 channels for all 6 channels. So it's going to spit those out and we'll be in good shape. Okay, we can leave those as mono, that's fine. And we're good to go. Then we can say export. And it's going to go to our exports folder, say export. And then to double check that everything worked, we can go and pull that export into Premiere Pro and load it up in our source monitor. So we look at it and then check our tracks, and there are all of our split audio channels. We have our dialogue, we have our sound effects, and our music. And that's how you do it. Okay, so depending on the part of the editing world that you're working in, many or maybe even all of your deliveries will go straight to the internet. The basic specs for an internet video are some flavor of H.264, and the popularity of the H.264 codec is eventually going to give way to H.265, which is more compressed but better quality and just all around better. And then eventually the popularity of the H.265 is going to give way to whatever comes after it. Bottom line is you need to stay on top of what the main codec is that people want on the internet. And it's really easy to find. If you look at sites like YouTube or Facebook, those specs are readily available. Okay, so I want to jump in here real quick to talk a little bit about H.264s. Like I mentioned, this is the web's favorite codec, but there could be some confusion about how to get the best picture quality for this codec. So I'm going to ignore the basic video settings. I think you understand our frame size, our frame rates, and the field orders and the aspect ratios. Now, one of the first things I want to point you to is render at maximum depth. If you have that checked, it's going to help your color values out. So that's going to help your video. Now, the more important thing that I want to look at is our bitrate encoding. There's a lot of confusion that circles around bit rates. Now, we can stick with constant bit rates, which means that there's a number that the video tries to hit, which in this case is 10 megabits per second. So what it's essentially saying is that no matter what is on screen, no matter what action is happening right now, the bit rate should always be 10 megabits per second. So this will generally give you a good result when you're exporting, but your file sizes are going to be larger because of it. Now, it could also hamper you if you have a really calm video where there's a lot of interview footage, and then all of a sudden we have something like this where there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of wrestling and fighting, and the bitrate can't keep up with that. So keep that in mind. My preference is to actually use a variable bitrate that's 1 pass. And again, we're going to give it a target bitrate, and you can make this 10 or higher. The higher your bit rate, the bigger your file size is going to be, but also the better quality your video is going to be. And what the variable bitrate does is it basically looks at what's going on inside the video. When we're sitting here in an interview, it's going to use a lower bitrate as it's chugging through this particular scene. Once we get to a scene that has more movement, it's going to increase that bitrate up to your target. And it might even go past your target slightly. Now, there's also this variable bitrate 2-pass option. Now, what this does for you is it doesn't increase your quality. That's a common misconception. So the 2-pass is actually going to make 1 pass where it encodes the video, and then it's going to do a 2nd pass now that it knows what the entire video looks like and compresses it even further. So it's going to give you higher quality with possibly a smaller file size. In my experience, the amount of time it takes to do a 2-pass encode is not worth the file size gains that you get. But depending on your situation, it might be. Like I said, I'm going to stick with 1 pass. Now, real quick, I do want to touch on the audio. When you're exporting, it's good to stick with AAC audio for H.264s. And looking at the bitrate, the higher you go here, the better your audio is going to sound. If your videos are headed to social media, which, let's be honest, they are, you're going to want to keep each platform's aspect ratios in mind, and you may even be tasked with conforming 16:9 video, horizontal video, into other aspect ratios like 9:16, vertical, or 1:1, square. So with any NLE, you can conform video aspect ratios manually. Simply duplicate the final sequence, change its resolution, and then manually move or possibly keyframe each clip as you need to. Now, some NLEs like Premiere Pro have automatic methods for doing that same process built right into it. In Premiere Pro's case, it's called auto reframe. So now I want to walk you through my process for creating a social media version of this video. So if we want to make it a 9:16 or a 1:1, this is what I would typically do. Well, actually before that, I want to talk about Adobe Premiere's auto reframe feature. So to get started with that, I'm going to duplicate our texted sequence, and I'm going to call this 9 by 16. And I'm going to right click and come down here and say auto reframe sequence. Now it's going to ask me, what do I want to make this into? So target aspect ratio is going to be 9 by 16. Motion tracking, we're going to leave this as default because most of our motion is pretty smooth. And clip nesting, I'm going to let it nest the clips so that it will give me the best option possible. Now, if you don't like the results, you can come back and unnest the clips. So let's see how we have here. All right. The next thing that I'm going to do before we dig into this is I'm going to actually remove my slate information, because if this is going on social media, we don't need the slate or those two pops. So get rid of that and get rid of this. Great. Okay, so I can already tell that this is not going to work for us. So some of our clips are looking good, and we could go through and manually move all of these clips, but in my opinion, because so many of them have just been squeezed down into this vertical or into this horizontal box, I think it makes the most sense to go through and do this manually. This is the reason why I wanted to start with auto reframe. In some cases, it works great. In many cases, it does not. So it's okay to try it out, but be prepared that a lot of times if you have to conform and edit, you're gonna have to do it by hand. So let's get rid of this. And now I'm going to start again, and I'm going to duplicate my texted sequence. And we're going to call this 9 by 16. And again, we'll get rid of this. Great. And pull that up to the front. And I'll even change my start time. Not that it's necessary, but it makes me feel better. Okay, cool. Now we're going to change our sequence settings to be 1080 by 1920. All right, now the fun begins. So what's the best way to do this? Well, I'm going to go ahead and shrink my timeline down because we're not really editing at this point. All we're doing is selecting clips. And I want to have the most real estate I can on my program monitor. So I'm going to do this. And now I'm going to come in here. Now I know a bunch of these clips because I cut this and I online this have motion effects applied to them. I don't want to change those motion effects. There's reasons they were added. So the best way to keep those effects is to actually use an effect on top of those effects. So we'll come here and add the transform effect and drag it onto my clip. And so from here, I can scale this up and move it over. Now, just by the nature of what we're doing here, these clips are not going to look perfect. These clips are not going to look perfect because they were not shot with the intent of being added in a 9 by 16 frame. That's just something that you have to live with when you're making these modifications. Now, if it's going to be created in a 9 by 16 frame, you can shoot it to match or work with higher resolution footage and adjust your cropping. So in this case, we have an interesting situation. So we have this adjustment layer that cuts off right here at the top and the bottom of the frame. Well, to deal with that, all we have to do is scale that whole layer up. And then we can go back and adjust our clips with a transform. And it all moves the way it's supposed to. And now this clip zooms in, so we need to make sure that the beginning of the clip is actually scaled up appropriately. So there we go. All right, and because this clip actually cuts into this next clip, it's going to be important that we get the same positioning from this clip. So I'm going to come here and remove this transform effect and copy and paste the one from the clip previous. Add it here. And then if we scrub through this, it works. I'm going to move this over just a little bit so that we get more of Emilio in there, get some more face. And I'm going to grab the transform effect, come over here, delete this, and re-add it. That looks good. And then we scale this up. And this is basically the process. You scale, you pan, and you scan. Pan and scan meaning you move your positioning left and right and up and down as needed to center the subjects in your frame. Now, there's a good chance that you'll come to some of these clips where you might actually have to keyframe some values. I'm going to fly through this stuff and speed this up real quick. When I land on those clips, I'll pause so that we can talk about it. Now, something I'm going to do here, because I just thought about this, I'm going to rename this, and we're just going to call this scale 9:16. And I'm going to copy this. So I'm going to use this effect, and on any of these clips that I just have to scale up, now I already have that 320% scale that I can drop into a clip, and I don't have to manually slide it every time, which saves us time as we go through the edit. Okay, so here's a good example of our action going out of frame before I really want it to. So it's going to start center frame, and as they start to move, I want the camera to also pan along with it. So I'm going to add a keyframe under my position value on my transform effect, move until I think about the time the camera stops, and I'm going to slide it over as well. Now, if you want to ease into this, it's going to make it look a little bit better. And that's how you do it. And another thing that you can do is if the camera doesn't move, you can try to match the motion of what's going on. So right as he starts to push, I'm going to do that move, and right as he lands, I'm going to try to finish it and get in frame.
My nickname is Scramble King. I got that from scrambling out of position.
We're having this issue because these are two different sources, I believe. Okay, so what we're going to do to fix this is I'm going to add a little transition, come to the middle of it, grab my second clip because it's the problem child, and I'm going to move this over until I can line him up. So to make this easier on myself, I'm going to make my overlay, my blend mode a difference. Oh, but it's not blending into that, so that won't work. So we'll just keep it as normal. And it looks like I'm a little bit small, so I'm going to scale it up. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so here's our first black video. This is similar to the adjustment layers. All we have to do is scale this up. So something that I want to do here, because he's so out of focus and we have our instructor over here on the right side of the screen, I'm going to actually do a pan to show that the instructor is watching him.
When I'm in here at the gym training, I'm drilling a lot of different positions, drilling a lot of different scenarios.
That'll work. So right as the camera moves again, and it lands.
By training, then that's what kind of motivates me because it puts me in a better mindset and a better mood after training each day.
Okay, so that is how we can form a 16 by 9 sequence into a 9 by 16 sequence. Moving on. Now it's time to look at the scary stuff that many editors don't get a chance to look at until it's too late. I know a ton of people working on shows that are presented with a list of delivery specs by a network that causes them to absolutely freak out and start nervously sweating. They've never seen all these numbers before, there's audio things they've never heard of, it's lots of paragraphs of text, and it can be very intimidating. Now, delivery specifications are basically guidelines for how a video should be sent to a network or a distributor, and it includes things like audio layouts and timecode specifications and video configurations. If you mess up any part of that delivery, your video is going to get kicked back to you in QC or quality control until you can get it right. Which, that's not a problem unless you miss a deadline because of it, and then there's serious consequences. So, let's take things slow by looking at a simple generic delivery format to start. This is a very basic format, and this looks familiar to how we did our prep for finish. The sequence timecode starts with a slate at 00595500, and then there's a 2-pop 3 seconds later, followed by 2 seconds of black, and then picture start on the hour. Now, to go along with the format, you're going to have to deliver in a specific type of codec, and most distributors and networks are going to have a list of accepted codecs that they will only accept. Most distributors and networks will have a long list of options, and some might even make your head spin, they're so long. But you can safely assume that the options here are going to be available to you, especially when we're talking about the intra-frame codecs like ProRes and DNx HD. So from the start of the course, I've referenced these codecs, but haven't really taken an in-depth look at how to export them from Premiere. So here we go. Look at us talking about codecs again. This is going to be fun, right? Okay, so let's look at this. We have our texted sequence, and I want to export it as Apple ProRes. So to do that, I would change my format to QuickTime, and then change my preset down to Apple ProRes 422. Now, digging a little bit further into that preset, we have a bunch of various flavors. So we could do 422, we could do 422 HQ, we could do 422 LT, we could do 422 proxy, 4x4, 4x4 XQ. What are all of these things? So, and then beyond that is just different flavors of QuickTime. So ProRes is all I really want you to focus on for now. ProRes 422 is an industry standard. I cannot emphasize that enough, that almost everybody takes ProRes 422. It's an amazing codec. It has good compression and it gives you a quality intra-frame file. HQ ups the data rate a little bit to give you a little better quality. LT lowers the data rate a little bit to give you a little less quality, and proxy really kills the data rate to give you a intra-frame codec that has a lot of compression artifacts, things like that, but it's good for working as proxy footage. The 4x4 footage is really good when working with graphic workflows or when sending projects out to a colorist, and the XQ version of Apple ProRes 4x4 honestly isn't necessary. It adds a lot of file size and doesn't give you a lot of benefits over the 4x4 version. Now, the next thing that I want to look at is the DNx HR/DNx HD. You can wrap this in a QuickTime wrapper, meaning it will be a .mov format. So from there, it's going to ask you what the resolution is going to be, and we have a bunch of different options where you can pick 1080i, 1080p, 720p. There's also a few different flavors where we have RGB, HQX, HQ, SQ, and LB. All of these basically go in quality order, RGB being the highest and LB being the lowest. Now, LB can basically be considered a proxy version of a codec. The other difference that I want to point out in DNx HR and DNx HD is DNx HD goes up to 1080p in frame size. Now, DNx HR is meant for high resolution footage, meaning 4K and above. We can also make other flavors of DNx HR and HD by making them an MXF wrapper. So a lot of times you'll see an MXF OP1A format. When you see that, don't get scared. It's simply asking for a DNx HD or DNx HR file. And from there, you can choose a preset. Now, there's a bunch of different options that Premiere comes built in. You can scroll through here until you find what you need. But again, essentially, you're looking at the HQ versus the HQX versus the LB versus the RGB. And if we jump back to QuickTime, they essentially go in the highest to lowest order: RGB, HQX, HQ, SQ, LB. And there you go. Now for the big boy spec sheet. At first glance, you can see how this might be a bit intimidating, and unfortunately, it gets worse. So before we move on, make sure you've downloaded the Part 11 PDFs, and in them, I've included a full spec sheet that we're going to go through. You got it pulled up? Good. Let's break this thing down, and then we're going to build it out. Okay, so yes, this box can be kind of intimidating, but if we take a look at it slowly, it's really not as scary as it seems. Let's start at the top. So up here we see that it says that it's in SMPTE drop frame timecode. That means that this is going to be delivered in 2997 frames per second. You can also tell that because you see all of these semicolons. A semicolon, which has this little comma thing that dips below the timecode, is an indicator that it's drop frame timecode. So one of the issues that this is going to present is that what we're using as our example TV show was cut in 2398, which is not drop frame. So we're going to have to work that out. Before we get to that though, I want to talk about all of these different items. So we have bars and tone, black, and slate. This is very similar to the basic format that we've already talked about and that we already introduced when we did our prep. Now, all of these numbers are basically saying how long, the duration, that we need to use each of these items. So let's walk through this, we'll build it out together and create our quote unquote TV show. Since this is built for a half hour, 30-minute TV show, we're not going to worry about the act structure. So Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, those won't be there. But because you're going to understand how this column system works, you should be able to figure this part out on your own as needed whenever you start working on a TV show. Now, some of the other stuff that's inside of this document is just more specification on how this format should be pieced together. We're not going to dive into all that, but it is very interesting to look at and read if you're curious. One of the things that this program does omit is that it doesn't tell us the delivery codec or the audio specifications for these files. So all I'll say to that is that you need to adhere to whatever the network tells you. It's going to be different per network, per where you're delivering it. On the audio spec side of things, I always recommend having an experienced audio engineer put that together. On the video side of things, make sure you're exporting in a good intra-frame codec like DNx HD or ProRes 422. Okay, let's jump into Premiere. So first thing we need to do is we're going to take this broadcast sequence and I'm going to change its settings to drop frame. I'm going to change its timecode to drop frame. So 2997, display format, drop frame timecode. Perfect. And we're going to say, okay. Now, when I click this, make sure you watch our clips. Watch what happens here. Everything kind of shifts a little bit because the frame count is now different. Our edit is not what it used to be. So the way that we get around that is we're actually going to remove this. And I'm going to grab a 2398 export of this sequence. Let's make sure our audio is tagged. Okay. So this is a 2398 export that I'm going to drop into my 2997 sequence. This makes sure that my timing stays intact. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So for now, let's work on building out the beginning of this clip. So we're going to zoom in. Zoom out a little bit. Okay, and let's go back to our spec. On our spec, we see that things start at 5830. Okay, so let's go here. So I know that my time code, my start time of my sequence needs to start at 00583000. Perfect. Okay, and let's move all of this down. I just selected everything and we'll move it down 1 minute just to get it out of our way. Now I want to go grab some bars and tone. The bars and tone that we used earlier to make our 2-pop will be just fine for this. So I'm going to go here, but now I want to make sure that I make this 1 minute long because if we look at the spec, it says 5830 to 5930, which the duration is 1 minute. So we'll make this 10000. Boop. I think I added one too many zeros there. 10000. There we go. And come back one. Okay, so now we have 1 minute duration and I will lay that into my sequence. Perfect, now let's keep going. So the next thing it says is we have black, and we have black from 5930 to 5935. So for that, we can either drop in some black video or we can simply jump forward. Oh, and this is interesting. So look at what we have here. Our bars and tone when we created was actually created in 2398. So our time is off by 2 frames. We want to make sure that this is accurate to the frame. So to fix that, I'm just going to back up and delete these frames. Perfect. So now our bars and tone ends at 5930, right where we want it to. Okay. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to jump forward 5 seconds. So plus 500. And this is going to be where we go to our slate. So our slate is going to start at 5935 and last for 15 seconds. So let's grab our slate and we'll move it back here. And then I'm going to say plus 15 seconds. Zoom in and I'll click this and drag. So that means it's going to come out at 5950. Looking at our format, we see 5950. That's good. Next thing we want to do is add a countdown from 10 seconds to 3 seconds with an audible tone at each 1 second interval. All right, that's a lot of words. So this is going to last for 7 seconds, and basically all we're doing is creating a countdown. Now, there's a good chance that if you're working on a TV show and you're building these formats, you're going to have just a simple file that you can drop in here that could do this for you. We're going to build one out using some text layers. So for the next 7 seconds, I need a countdown. And this does not have to be fancy. It just has to show us what's going on. So I'm going to take my text tool, click in my program monitor, and just type 10. Let's give it a good font because, hey, it needs to look nice, right? And we'll call this Futura Medium. Oh, make sure we select this. Cool. And let's scale it up a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to center it, and we're going to keep this. Actually, I'm going to make this right, justified. And I'm going to position it in the bottom right corner of my frame. Okay, that looks good to me. So I'm going to move forward 1 second, plus 100. And then we're going to change that number, plus 100. This is going to be 9. And we'll do this until we get to 3 seconds. So okay, and it doesn't want to see the 2. So we're going to leave it at 3. Now we need to go and add an audible tone at each second mark. So we're going to start at 10. I'm going to turn off selection follows playhead because it is driving me crazy. And we're going to make this 1 frame. And all we're going to do is drop in that 1 frame. So all we're going to do is drop in that 1 frame at every second. Glad we checked this. Add another one right there. Okay, so that last beep lets us know we're at 2 seconds. Last thing we have is a white, so a sync indicator, 2 frames of white video. This goes from 59:57:06. Okay, I realized that we didn't need to add the 3, so I'm actually going to remove this. And now I'm going to come back, look at my spec, and it says a sync indicator. So 2 frames of white video and a 1 kilohertz tone at 59:57:06. So let's jump to 59:57:06. Let's go grab some white video. So File, New, Color Matte. We're going to go white, and we'll say white. Add that to our graphics. Wonderful. And we want 2 frames of this. So let's drag it into our source monitor, move forward 1, and we have 2 frames, and drop it into our sequence. Make sure our tracks are targeted. And it wants a 1 kilohertz tone underneath of that. So we'll take bars and tone. We're at 1 kilohertz, amplitude's -20, that looks great. So I'm actually just going to take this clip, drag it over, and zoom in, and pull it over right there. Great. Let's look back at our format. Okay, 2 frames. Then we have black from 59:57:08. Good. All the way until picture start at hour 1. So we'll jump to hour 1, 01, 00, 00. Get rid of this 2 pop that's right there. Whoa, that's not what we wanted to do. And now we want to move our picture start to right there. Now we have a slate on this. This is the basic slate that we did. We're going to cut that off and move this to hour 1 in our document. So let's go ahead and turn on our overlays. Move that there. Great. And we're in business. Okay, that is our format. So that is how we build out a delivery format for a network. Now, obviously, we would need to change our audio specifications and also export in whatever codec that they asked us to. But that's that. Whew, okay, that was a ton of fun, right? For sure. So broadcast commercials are in a similar boat to the full-length shows and must adhere to some rigorous specs. And the specifications listed here were pulled from Extreme Reach, a well-known media trafficking service. You can see that the sheet itself is clearly formatted differently, but once you begin to read it, it's not at all that different from the spec sheet that we receive from the TV show. There's a 5-second slate, 2 seconds of black, and then the spot starts at hour 1. Now, one thing that is different is the ad ID, or ISCI code, ISCI. Traffickers use this ISCI code to reference commercial TV spots, and depending on who traffics the commercial, the ISCI code will have certain criteria it must meet and the way that it's going to be formatted. But it's otherwise completely made up. So when you're delivering multiple broadcast spots for a project, it's best for a producer to use a spreadsheet to track the ads and their slate info, including the ISCI information. So before we close out, I want to touch on a burning question you might have. If 2398 has a cinematic look, but broadcast in the United States is 2997, how do you deliver 2398 material? Well, the rule that I mentioned back in part 7 still applies. Shoot and edit natively in 2398. Finish and export in 2398. And then convert the exported 2398 video to broadcast spec at 2997. After it's been converted to 2997, then go back and add the slate information and appropriate timing that the network or trafficker needs in the 2997 frame rate. So this helpful tip is hotly debated, and though I'm telling you to do this method, others would argue for another method. In my experience, though, this has worked well for me, and that's why I'm sharing it with you. Really, though, the best solution, if you can make it happen, is to edit the entire thing in 2398 and export the timeline in 2398, and then let the network or the trafficking service do the conversion to 2997 for you. Many times, though, that's not an option. Okie doke. Congrats, my friend. You have done it. Up next is the last part of Advanced Workflows with Premiere Pro. Grab your feather duster because we're heading into the archives.